I really want to thank all of you for being here, and especially Jack Fiegel. Jack's still not here, right? We were waiting for him. You know, okay, when he comes in, no matter what I'm saying, everybody start applauding, okay? Because you realize Jack Fiegel is a one-man, archdiocesan, catechetical, faith renewal. Look at that. See, they're all nodding their heads, right? They know it. So he's a one-man kind of just mover and shaker, and we really owe a lot to Jack. Anybody who's ever had to organize one of these things knows what it's like, and he's up to almost his 20th Orientale Lumen. When Jack called and invited me to present on a topic related to marriage in the Eastern Christian tradition, I said, well, can I do something on married priests? In fact, and he said, well, in fact, I was hoping that you would talk about married priests. The paper you're going to get tonight has a history to it. It's not the paper that I would normally want to present to a crowd like this, but the two other ones that I have in my back pocket have already been presented elsewhere in front of crowds like this. And the one that I would have really preferred to do is on the spirituality, the witness of married priests, in particular during the Soviet persecution. I mean, my wife is the granddaughter of a married priest. Her father was from a family of 10 children. So her grandfather and grandmother spent 10 years in Siberia with the two youngest of their 10 children. And by the way, they were as politically clean as they could be. The Soviets waited all the way until 1948 to arrest them, and it's a very long story how they ended up, you know, in Siberia. But I'd spoken about that at a conference. At a conference in Rome, and you know, it's going to be published soon, so I don't want to repeat that here. And there's another one that outlines some of the history of this dynamic and or the whole question of married Eastern Catholic priests in North America, and that's already been published too. So what you're going to get tonight, if I could just kind of alert you where I'm headed with this, and by the way, because it is an evening session, I've got a handout for you so you can follow along. I'm going to be reading my lecture. This may help you when I get into some of those really long quotations. But where I'm headed with this is basically an analysis of some of the thinking, and I stress just some. Fortunately, this is not a majority of theologians, but some of them are very, very powerful. A summary of some of the thinking that dominates in the writings of certain Catholic theologians who feel that ordaining married men, even in the Eastern traditions, is somehow illegitimate. In essence, the task was to discover, you know, where's the theology coming from? Because ultimately, of course, you know, a lot of the restrictions that have existed and technically still exist to the very present day have a theological underpinning. So the question is, where is this coming from theologically? So that's what you should be focused on as I read through this paper. Anyone familiar with the pronouncements of the Second Vatican Council and several other official Catholic statements regarding the married presbyterate and presbyteral celibacy may be surprised that the issue would even arise in the context of ecumenical discussions between Catholics and Orthodox. The Second Vatican Council and several subsequent documents clearly affirm the tradition of optional celibacy among Eastern Christians. However, as historians know, affirmative assertions of this kind sometimes reveal more about the need to make them than about the fact that they're actually being honored. Let me begin, though, by noting that our new Pope, Francis, while yet Cardinal Archbishop Buenos Aires, gave indications that for him, and this is continuing, by the way, I can't update this every week, but he's gave indications already back in Argentina that for him, the Catholic Church's official pronouncements regarding presbyteral celibacy provide the inspiration guidelines for his own approach to the question. However, before summarizing these pronouncements, as well as then Cardinal Bergoglio's helpful thought on the topic, allow me to review what it is that could make this question a matter of concern in Orthodox Catholic relations, and why it is important, as it were, to put out the fire before it becomes one more hindrance to East-West rapprochement. Let me also immediately point out that the concern about developments within Catholicism surrounding this question do not derive from any desire, at least on my part, to see the Latin Church change its discipline. Let me say this again. We Eastern Catholics do not appreciate when Roman Catholics tell us what to do. I am not about to tell Latin Rite Catholics what they should be doing. Okay, so and then let me just add to that. I don't think I can ever talk to certain individuals about optional celibacy in the Eastern churches without, for some strange reason, creating the impression that I am opposed to celibacy. I don't know how many times this has happened where the immediate response is, oh, you're attacking celibacy. So I'm not attacking celibacy. All I want is for the Eastern churches, in particular the Eastern Catholic churches, to be able to do what is in fact guaranteed not just by tradition, but also by the authoritative statements of the, let's use that term, magisterium of the Catholic Church. So please, whatever you do, don't start thinking that I'm trying to chip away at celibacy in the Latin Rite or whatever. I mean, as I say, it's in one sense, it's none of my business. So rather, a certain concern is warranted because the developments summarized below could impact even more negatively on Roman Catholic attitude towards Orthodox and Eastern Catholic married priests, and thus their churches. These developments relate to the fact that in the interest of presenting a positive theology of mandatory presbyteral celibacy, certain Catholic authors occasionally engage in detrimental totalizing. It is, of course, the totalizing that creates the problem, not the desire to provide an explanation of Roman Catholic practice. And it is a new wave of totalizing, verging at times on dogmatism, that makes this paper necessary. I now talk about the lex continentiae as so-called apostolic practice. If you don't understand what lex continentiae is, you will by the end of this section. In 1981, Christian Cocchini published Origine apostolique du célibat sacerdotal. The book's central thesis is that marital continence for the ordained must have been apostolic practice. In other words, you get ordained, even though you're married, you get ordained. After that, no more nuptial relations. Okay? And his thesis, his strong conviction is that this must have been apostolic practice. The direct relevance to Orthodox Catholic discussions is that Cocchini's contention spawned not only a book that claimed that this was also the authentic Eastern tradition, but a series of articles by prominent Roman Catholic hierarchs and theologians repeating the claim. In fact, within the last several years, and this is why this is particularly relevant, because it's just within the last several years, I'd say the last 10 years, for certain Roman Catholics, this claim, Cocchini's claim, has become axiomatic. Those of you with the footnoted version can see all the footnotes. The Cardinal Prefect of the Vatican's Congregation for the Clergy recently referred to celibacy as the apostolic way of life. In the very first paragraph of his foreword to a book entitled Married Priests, 30 Crucial Questions About Celibacy, the Cardinal asserts that ecclesiastical celibacy, apostolica vivendi forma, the apostolic way of life, should be reckoned as one of the greatest goods and most powerful vehicles of truth, one of the greatest gifts that the Lord left to His Church and continually reaffirms. Now again, as I've hinted just a couple of minutes ago. The point is not to question the outstanding nature of this gift, but only to warn against univocal grounding in apostolic practice. Coccini's scholarship and that of his Eastern Catholic disciple, Roman Trulli, has been soundly critiqued by a phalanx of renowned Catholic academics. And again, those 6 of you, the panelists with the footnotes, I mean, it's astounding. It's first it reads like a who's who of prominent church historians, Catholic historians, and then it's very, very damning. In other words, they really go after Coccini. Nonetheless, in spite of all this criticism, in spite of scathing book reviews, on the basis of Coccini's hypothesis, and it can be nothing more than a hypothesis, and a flimsy one at that, prominent Roman Catholics have been implying, to put it most starkly, and this is the real rub, that countless numbers of children born to Orthodox and Eastern Catholic married priests and their lawfully wedded wives throughout the centuries have been born in contravention of apostolic tradition. Now, there are children of Orthodox and Eastern Catholic priests still alive today who can recount stories of unedifying treatment at the hands of Catholic educators during the pre-Vatican II period. It's horrible what the kids of priests, whether Orthodox or Eastern Catholic, would be subjected to in some Catholic schools. Being referred to as illegitimate children, having their dad referred to, as a Protestant minister or a rabbi or whatever. And these were school teachers who. And so this kind of stuff can get rather sensitive. As proof that the Eastern churches maintain a vestige of apostolic practice, the proponents of this Lex Continentiae adduce the mandatory celibacy of Eastern Christian candidates to the episcopate. For them, the fact that the bishop possesses the fullness of the priesthood, which by the way is not a term, not a category used generally within Eastern Christian circles. But anyway, for them the fact that the bishop possesses the fullness of the priesthood demonstrates that even in the East there is an appreciation for the desirable link between celibacy and the priesthood. However, the renowned Jesuit canonist George Nedungatt critiques this approach thus. Pablo Gefael, to quote the last writer on the topic to date, in other words, Nedungatt is quoting Gefael, who wrote in a piece that was in Folia Canonica, Clerical Celibacy. Pablo Gefael explains the obligation of celibacy on the part of bishops in the East as an exigency of the highest degree of priesthood and as expressive of their spousal relationship with the Church. Nedungatt continues, this is not only to invert history and theology, but to ignore the best recent scholarship on the Council in Trullo, rescued from the debris of past Latin polemics. Unaware of it, he, Gefael, writes, and now Nedungatt is quoting Gefael, whose argument Nedungatt is quite, I think, forcefully countering. But anyway, Gefael writes, the Oriental discipline regarding celibate bishops, temporal continence, and the matrimonial impediment of sacred orders can be understood only under the light of the underlying theological basis of celibacy, and concludes viewing the present practice of the uxorate, in other words, married clergy, as a permissive law of a situation less proper to the clerical state. Now, Nedungatt later adds the following about the celibacy of Eastern bishops. I quote, it is through the imperial legislation of Justinian that episcopal celibacy was introduced into the canons, as Pizzakis has shown, and we also heard it from Metropolitan Callistos, who was dead on earlier on during our panel discussion. So Nedungatt says, to see it as originating instead from the fullness of the priesthood is the fantasy of ahistorical theology. In other words, it was only after Justinian had introduced episcopal celibacy into civil law that the Church of Byzantium, more than a century later, made it part of canon law. So it's the imperial authorities introducing a celibate episcopate, and more than a century later, it becomes church law. So, you're talking about a civil development that then, if you want to theologize about that, fine, but you got to keep in mind that your theology is going to be on shaky grounds. And Justinian's main concern, as Metropolitan Callistus appropriately pointed out earlier, Justinian's main concern was to curtail abuses by wealthy bishops who were inclined to transfer the church's property to their children. In certain circles, the notion of an apostolic source for the Lex Continentia is now so entrenched that Roman Catholic author Stefan Hyde can argue for its possible reception by a new ecumenical consensus. Just 2 years ago he wrote, and I'm quoting here, "The Eastern interpretation regarding Nicaea's one refutation of the need for clerical continence must therefore be rejected because in historical terms it is untenable. The best Greek fathers of the Church in the first centuries propagated clerical continence, and the highly esteemed Epiphanius of Salamis, to mention only the most prominent and widely recognized example, speaks unmistakably about indispensable clerical continence, whereby he means exactly the same discipline that prevailed at that time in the Latin West. Ecumenical dialogue today," and this is quite interesting, this is Stefan Hyde, "ecumenical dialogue today can start with these historical insights and perhaps arrive at a new consensus." The subtext is the Orthodox may want to accept mandatory clerical celibacy, or at least clerical continence. Earlier in the same piece, Hyde writes, "Interestingly enough, the evidence for clerical continence in the first few centuries is even clearer in the East than in the West." Yes. He goes on to insist that the first tremors that weakened the unrestricted duty to practice continence came no doubt from the major schisms that the Church in the East experienced. Hyde has in mind Syrian and Coptic Christianity. Schism and clerical nuptial relations have now been linked. Okay, so you have schism, and what's the next step? Oh, clerical nuptial relations. So my next section is entitled Spousal Imagery in the Priesthood from Metaphors to Metaphysics. The next significant development of a totalizing or potentially totalizing nature has occurred with the elaboration of Christological spousal imagery and its univocal application to the priesthood. A literature review confirms Father Basilio Petra's observation that in some circles, and I quote, "ordination has come to be understood not only as a consecration which configures one ontologically to Christ as shepherd and head, but also as a consecration which configures one to Christ the bridegroom," and the emphasis is in the original. The following paragraphs from St. John Paul II's Pastores Dabo Vobis sometimes provide inspiration for those who would like to create such an ontological configuration. However, as is obvious, there is no reason why one must interpret the Pope's text in this manner. The most relevant paragraphs of the Apostolic Exhortation in 1992 read as follows, and I apologize, but I'm going to read this long quotation, which is why I gave it to you in a handout. "The priest is called to be the living image of Jesus Christ, the spouse of the Church. Of course, he will always remain a member of the community as a believer alongside his other brothers and sisters who have been called by the Spirit. But in virtue of his configuration to Christ, the head and shepherd, the priest stands in this spousal relationship with regard to the community. Inasmuch as he represents Christ, the head, shepherd, and spouse of the church, the priest is placed not only in the church but also in the forefront of the church. In his spiritual life, therefore, he is called to live out Christ's spousal love toward the church, his bride. Therefore, the priest's life ought to radiate this spousal character, which demands that he be a witness to Christ's spousal love and thus be capable of loving people with a heart which is new, generous, and pure, with genuine self-detachment, with full, constant, and faithful dedication, at the same time with a kind of divine jealousy, and even with a kind of maternal tenderness, capable of bearing the pangs of birth until Christ be formed in the faithful. But the will of the Church finds its ultimate motivation in the link between celibacy and sacred ordination, which configures the priest to Jesus Christ, the head and spouse of the Church." Notice the absence of the word ontological there. That's my argument. In other words, people have started inserting the word ontological there, or interpreting this in that way, but the word is not there. The church, as the spouse of Jesus Christ, wishes to be loved by the priest in the total and exclusive manner in which Jesus Christ, her head and spouse, loved her. Priestly celibacy, then, is the gift of the self in and with Christ to his church, and expresses the priest's service to the church in and with the Lord. And so priestly celibacy should not be considered just as a legal norm or as a totally external condition for admission to ordination, but rather as a value that is profoundly connected with ordination, whereby man takes on the likeness of Jesus Christ, the good shepherd and spouse of the church. So John Paul II then continues in paragraph 72, the people of God should be able to say about the priest, who is increasingly matured in human sensitivity, something similar to what we read about Jesus in the letter to the Hebrews. For we have not a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sinning. The formation of the priest in its spiritual dimension is required by the new gospel life to which he has been called in a specific way by the Holy Spirit poured out in the sacrament of holy orders. The Spirit, by consecrating the priest and configuring him to Jesus Christ, head and shepherd, creates a bond which, located in the priest's very being, demands to be assimilated and lived out in a personal, free and conscious way through an ever richer communion of life and love and an ever broader and more radical sharing of the feelings and attitudes of Jesus Christ. In this bond between the Lord Jesus and the priest, an ontological and psychological bond. Okay, now notice, obviously, there's a long tradition of talking about an ontological change, an ontological configuration with Christ, but the word here is not used in reference to this spousal dimension. In this bond between the Lord Jesus and the priest, an ontological and psychological bond, a sacramental and moral bond, is the foundation, likewise the power for that life according to the Spirit and that radicalism of the gospel to which every priest is called today, and which is fostered by ongoing formation in spiritual aspect. This formation proves necessary also for the priestly ministry to be genuine and spiritually fruitful. This is great stuff. The point is that the married priest should also find a way to live this out, if in fact the priesthood is one. None of the above need be problematic for Orthodox Catholic relations. Or rather, if read in the context of the Catholic Church's other, and by the way, far more authoritative pronouncements, it certainly need not be problematic, because Pastores Dabo Vobis is a post-synodal exhortation. It's not a dogmatic constitution, it's not a decree of a council or whatever. However, some of the recent literature on celibacy implies that a married man is simply incapable of such commitment to his flock, which, by the way, can be the case. But, I always have to tell people, because you get this nonsense, people coming up to you and say, oh, I wish all the priests were married. I say, I don't wish all the priests were married. They say, oh, but, married priests are better. I say, are you kidding? First, I'm a married priest, and I have tons of them. There are as many bad married priests as there are bad celibate priests, So it's just, again, it's another thing that we need to put out there. The point is, however, to stop making these comparisons. And in Eastern Christian territories, nobody used to make these comparisons until celibacy started being imposed as a mandatory requirement. At that point, the married guys have to then, they feel compelled to kind of start fighting back by saying, well, hold it, we're okay too. And then the people who are trying to impose celibacy, well, actually, you're not okay, and these are the bad things you've done, And as you can imagine, it's a very silly war, but that's actually where many of the discussions are frequently. In either case, ironically, in recent memory alone, thousands of married Orthodox and Eastern Catholic priests in the former USSR and East Bloc demonstrated genuine self-detachment during deportations and executions. The persecution sometimes included their wives and children. And by the way, I'm just going to add a little story here, and somebody has to cut me off. Jack, when am I supposed to stop talking? Does anybody know when I'm supposed to stop? Okay, in a half an hour. Okay, so I'll just make sure that I stop at 8 o'clock, but I need to add the following, even though it's in another paper that I wrote on this topic. Some of you are familiar with the name Cardinal Joseph Slipet, right? How many of you have ever heard of Cardinal Joseph or Patriarch Joseph Slipet? Okay. How many of you know that when he was released from Siberia in 1963, within a couple of years, he started ordaining scores of married Ukrainian Catholic men to the priesthood. How many of you know that? Okay. I was ordained by him. A lot of us, we had to be ordained there because we couldn't be ordained in North America, and our ordinations had to be done surreptitiously. My wife was the first of all of the wives who was able to be present at her husband's ordination. This was as late as 1981. And the only reason she was there is because she didn't ask anybody. Our pastor said, here's the money for a ticket. Don't ask permission, just go. So all these other... I don't know whether that's still working. Is that still working? All these other guys, I have all sorts of friends whose wives couldn't be at their ordination. Okay? I couldn't tell my parents I was ordained until I got back from Rome. Okay? Now, many of you know about that. What I myself didn't realize until I first went to Ukraine after the fall of communism, that when he was rector of the seminary in western Ukraine, the future Cardinal Patriarch Joseph Slipei was a vehement opponent of married clergy. He did everything within his power to make sure that anybody who wanted to be a married priest would have problems. And it was only thanks to Sheptytsky that somehow you were able to get around the rector and get ordained. And why do I say this? Because when I told somebody in Lviv that Slipei had ordained me, and this is an elderly woman who had grown up across the road from the cathedral, her dentures almost fell. She said, "You're a married guy? Slipei ordained you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Don't you realize that the guy he's radically opposed to optional celibacy?" What happened was that Slipei had been in Siberia for 18 years, and he was there with more than 300 married priests. So when he came, when he emerged from exile, and somebody would try to convince him that, the married guy, because I grew up with this. My dad told me when I was a kid, can't have married priests because they just can't deal with the pressure. They just, sooner or later they have to make choices, and it's, so I grew up with this. Obviously, I think it's quite significant that Slipei, in his mature years, he was already in his late 50s by that time, could undergo such a transformation in his thinking simply because of what he saw in the witness of these married priests and their wives, and sometimes children. But as just mentioned, if Pastores Dabo Vobis avoids totalizing the spousal connection between celibacy and the priesthood, especially in an ontological way, certain Roman Catholic authorities are less careful in their own formulations. The following was written in 2011 by the aforementioned Cardinal Prefect of the Congregation for the Clergy. So this is just 3 years ago. Certainly and I'm quoting here, certainly one particularly important document dealing with all the themes concerned with priesthood and priestly formation was the Apostolic Exhortation Pastores Dabo Vobis, in which the gift of celibacy is understood as part of the bond between Jesus and the priest, and for the first time, the psychological importance of this bond is mentioned also in a way that is not separate from the ontological importance. Now that's my emphasis added. Indeed, and I'm continuing the quotation, indeed we read in number 72, in this bond between the Lord Jesus and the priest, an ontological and psychological bond, a sacramental and moral bond, is the foundation and likewise the power for that life according to the Spirit and that radicalism of the gospel to which every priest is called today and which is fostered by ongoing formation in its spiritual aspect. Now note how the Cardinal Prefect identifies celibacy on the one hand and the priest's life according to the Spirit and evangelical radicalism on the other. The Cardinal has taken the liberty of suggesting that the bond with Christ, located in the priest's very being, presumes celibacy. And he's taken the liberty of suggesting that the identification bears ontological importance. A more precise reading of Pastores Dabo Vobis does not require such conclusions. Later in the same article, the same Cardinal Prefect writes, although there are sometimes remarkably different emphases, more liturgical, sacral, or more Christological pastoral, the uninterrupted magisterium of the aforementioned pontiffs is consistent in basing celibacy on the theological reality of the ministerial priesthood, on the ontological, sacramental configuration of the priest to Christ the Lord, on his participation in his Christ's unique priesthood, and on the imitatio Christi that implies. The Cardinal Prefect of the Congregation for the Clergy continues continues with the following appeal and assertion. In light of the papal magisterium that has been examined, the reduction of celibacy to a mere ecclesiastical law, which is so widespread in some circles, must be overcome. It is a law only because it is an intrinsic requirement of the priesthood and of the configuration to Christ intended by the sacrament of holy orders. As we shall see below, the papal magisterium of the present pontiff, Pope Francis, while cherishing celibacy, of course, hardly shares this approach. The views of the Cardinal Prefect nonetheless find resonance among other Catholic authorities. The Secretary of the Vatican Congregation for the Clergy has written the following in an article posted on the Vatican's website, and I quote, "It is on the strength of this essential, ontological, and existential assimilation to Christ that the extreme congruity and relevance of priestly celibacy can and should be judged. The priest, inasmuch as he is alter Christus, finds his true identity, his true raison d'etre, his true style in his intimate personal relationship with Christ. The force binding celibacy to the priesthood lies in the ontology of the priest." That Archbishop's reflection includes the following remarks. Then again, the comparison with the married priests of some Oriental churches does not seem to be a valid one, for here we have an ancient institution and not one established for reasons of expediency. It must also be said that actually in those churches, be they Catholic or Orthodox, the law of celibacy for the priesthood is recommended and held in high regard. Now, the Archbishop's reference to ancient institution has to be appreciated. Must be appreciated, especially as he has avoided suggesting that these priests, no doubt, were originally expected to curtail nuptial relations after ordination. And while it is not actually the case that among the Orthodox the law of celibacy for the priesthood is recommended, there is indeed a high regard for those clergy living in this state. I mean, I'm overjoyed that my son is interested in being a celibate priest. I think it's fantastic. I mean, that's why you should have married priests, because they can give birth to, monks and celibate priests, etc. It's actually because he has a good mother. However, it is the Archbishop's following remark that especially deserves our attention. And this is I don't know where this is coming from, but it's actually on the Vatican website. And I quote, and remember, this is the Secretary of the Congregation for the Clergy. This, for example, is what a Russian Orthodox bishop of the Patriarchate of Moscow had to say on the subject in the immediate post-conciliar period. "For us Orthodox, the priesthood is a sacred function. For this reason, we are convinced that you Westerners, you Latins, are not on the right path where you allow the question of ecclesiastical celibacy to be debated in public, in the form of public opinion. In our Oriental tradition, it has been possible to authorize the ordination of a handful of married men." I don't know what the guy's talking about. "As in any case you have done and go on doing in certain regions." So he's obviously thinking about Eastern Catholics here. "But take care, in the West, if you separate the priesthood from celibacy, a very swift decadence will set in. The West," this is a Russian Orthodox bishop, by the way, supposedly speaking, "the West is not mystical enough to tolerate the marriage of its clergy without degenerating. The Church of Rome, and this is to her glory, has preserved this ecclesiastical ascesis for a whole millennium. Beware of compromising it." End of quotation. Now, unfortunately, this Archbishop, who I haven't checked whether he still is, but as of 3 years ago, he was still the Secretary of the Congregation for Clergy, this Archbishop does not reveal the identity of this Russian Orthodox bishop, nor does he provide a source for the quotation. Such information could have helped in determining what could possibly be meant by the Russian bishop's alleged reference to the fact that in our Orient tradition it has become possible to authorize the ordination of a handful of married men. I think there are probably a handful of married Orthodox priests right here. Maybe you're the ones that were, mandated to be ordained. I don't know, but a handful is a rather small number. Now, in North America, a recent conference on clerical celibacy at the University of Notre Dame produced papers demonstrating far greater nuancing and acumen. Most of the published papers provide solid reflection on the topic and avoid the kind of totalizing referred to above. Among the instances, however, where more precision would have been advisable is the following formulation. In an article entitled "The Virginity of Jesus and the Celibacy of His Priests," an American Roman Catholic archbishop writes, it's in that collection, and I quote, "Having considered the identity of gift and giver in the offering that establishes a nuptial covenant, we are now prepared to articulate the intrinsic connection between Jesus' virginity and his priesthood." Now, as legitimate as it might be to reflect on such a connection, one is surprised by a subsequent step in this hierarch's articulation. And I mention it here as it bears more directly on Orthodox Catholic discussions. So in a footnote in that same article, devoted to the Eastern requirement of celibacy for bishops, the Roman Catholic author, in other words, this rather prominent, or at least well-known archbishop here in the United States, that author refers to Orthodox Archbishop Peter Riet's article on the topic of married bishops in the Orthodox Church, and writes the following. So this is a Roman Catholic archbishop here in the United States writing about Archbishop Peter Riet's discussion of married bishops, or the whole question of episcopal celibacy, rather, in the Orthodox Church. So I'm quoting the Roman Catholic bishop now. Riet sets as one of his goals to discover the reasons underlying this development, that is, promoting only celibates to the episcopacy. In working to that end, he never mentions the virginity of Jesus. Rather, he asserts that the requirement of episcopal celibacy has no dogmatic significance. And I finish the quotation by the Roman Catholic Archbishop. "In view of the Church's belief in Jesus' virginity, this seems surprising." Now, the precision that I have in mind is the following. As legitimate as it may be to reflect on the dogmatic significance of Jesus' virginity, it is not legitimate, in my estimation, to take the next step and suggest that dogmatic significance be ascribed to episcopal celibacy, which is actually what that author has done. Earlier in the article, the American Roman Catholic Archbishop discusses one of the inspirations for his thought on this topic, and as is evident, the reference below to the innermost of faith and revelation brings us again to a kind of dogmatization of the celibacy question. He writes, "I'm convinced that understanding the celibacy of priests as a participation in Jesus' virginity is the key to our being able to fulfill this part of our mission in the Church." End of quotation. This, as far as I'm concerned, is unassailable. But the very next sentence reads, and this is where the problem emerges. This is the Roman Catholic Archbishop writing, "In this I see myself as following in the path marked out by Hans Urs von Balthasar when he wrote that the reasons for priestly celibacy should be presented as inseparably bound with the innermost of revelation and faith." Now, the adjective innermost obviously functions here as a substantive. It presumably refers to the innermost content of revelation and faith, or the innermost gist, substance, etc., of revelation and faith. Von Balthasar's statement is significant by itself, and the attempt to determine its context as well as the language of the original piece led me to the actual article, which revealed similarly significant formulations. Von Balthasar's assertions deserve citing in full here for two reasons. First, without doubt, the Swiss theologian was not only one of the most renowned theologians of the 20th century, but his influence quite legitimately continues to grow. I mean, if you're familiar with von Balthasar, you realize you're dealing with a very sharp mind. Second, so he deserves attention. Second, in our discussions of the growth of totalizing Latin theologies of mandatory celibacy, it is important to note that this trend is not confined to curial theology. Because some of you say, well, until now, Father Peter, you've been quoting, some cardinal over at the Vatican, some secretary in a congregation, that to be very postmodern and to allow oneself to degenerate into kind of political debate. Those are hegemonic assertions by people in positions of authority. Well, this is von Balthasar. I mean, von Balthasar was not creating curial or institutional theology. So the following quotations are from von Balthasar's article, The Meaning of Celibacy, published in English translation in 1976. Taken individually, they might not warrant apprehension, but when read together, concern seems fitting. Let me begin with the paragraph that forms the context for the citation already adduced. Dogma, exegesis, pastoral studies must be taught so that discernment is induced and is given a sound basis, which cannot be done in a broad study plan, but must be fostered by frequent and varied approaches. This would demand that professors, rectors, and spiritual directors work together and in the same spirit. The reasons for priestly celibacy that reasons for priestly celibacy be not merely hung on extraneously in a superficial manner easily refuted by modern psychology and sociology, but that they be presented as inseparably bound with the innermost of revelation and faith. Now note the reference to dogma, though on the other hand, no one is suggesting that reflection on celibacy should remain extraneous or superficial. I mean, if you're going to take that kind of a leap, if you're going to accept celibacy, you want the best theology, spirituality, psychology, presenting the insights, the experience, etc. But von Balthasar is going a little bit beyond that. Then there are two citations of a more inspirational thrust. The Eucharistic sacrifice of Jesus on the cross is inseparably united with his celibacy, and Christian celibacy is often spoken of as an eschatological sign. This is well and good, except for the article "an." Actually, it is the sign, and as such it becomes indispensable. That's von Balthasar speaking, by the way. Note that the context is a discussion of presbyteral celibacy. Thus, the indispensability relates to the latter. Finally, we find two remarks bearing more directly on Eastern realities. I quote von Balthasar. When St. Paul says, "I wish all were like me, unmarried," he does not imply one of two alternatives, but unmistakably gives preference to one of the two, to a life thrown as a whole into the fire of Christ, ablaze like glowing iron. The viri probati are cold iron, no matter how zealous they might be personally. The unmarried shepherd is the glowing iron, and he alone can communicate his radiance to others. Now, von Balthasar was reacting to the possibility in the 70s that the German episcopate, the Roman Catholic episcopate, might consider ordaining viri probati, older men whose children are already grown up, and that's a reaction to that. But it impinges on Eastern realities, as we see a little bit later. Of course, in referring to viri probati, Balthasar does not have in mind Eastern Catholic men per se, but that is the term used to describe some of the married candidates or potential candidates to the priesthood in North American Eastern Catholic eparchies. These are older men, usually with grown children. In any case, von Balthasar would consider these older men unacceptable. Now, squaring this with 1 Timothy 3:4-5 would be an interesting exercise in exegesis. And then there's von Balthasar's direct reference to Eastern practice, both Orthodox and Catholic. I quote, "Among other things, we would have to study the history of the separated churches and how their clergy fared, and would have to take to heart the experience of the Eastern Church in learning all about the pastoral, juridical, and financial problems of the Eastern married clergy, which are so obviously complex that more than one uniate bishop does not use his authority to ordain married priests anymore." Now, certainly throughout history there have been uniate bishops who were sincerely convinced, and I don't doubt their sincerity, they were sincerely convinced that married candidates to the priesthood were undesirable. However, one needs to understand that their authority to ordain these married men was rarely unconstrained. As for the separated churches, in view of von Balthasar's presuppositions, both pastoral and theological, it is hard to imagine that any study would change or would have changed his mind about married clergy. In any case, note how, as always, ad hominem and sociological arguments are permitted in the campaign for mandatory celibacy. Similar arguments, however, marshaled in defense of optional celibacy, generally evoke denunciation or even ecclesial ostracism. So I've got 10 minutes left. Now, there is writing that remains academic in the pejorative sense, and then there is writing of consequence. One could probably ignore a fair amount of the literature cited above, and not for the fact that it apparently provides the motivation for authoritative decisions by influential dicasteries in the Catholic Church, decisions that can impact on Catholic-Orthodox relations and do impact, they certainly do impact, on interritual relations within Catholicism. Let us then turn to some of these decisions. There's enough literature regarding the ban on the ordination of married candidates to the priesthood in Eastern Catholic churches to give a sense of how this question has harmed Orthodox Catholic relations in the past. This is not the place to review that literature. Allow me rather to focus on more recent events, which in any case provide the immediate motivation for my present research into the fate of Catholic pronouncements on celibacy. George Nedungat, in the magisterial volume already cited, reviews the prohibition on ordaining married Eastern Catholic candidates to the priesthood in the West, as well as the ban on importing married clergy from home territories, and cites 3 Vatican decrees, and in the end states the following regarding the present situation. Whether the above-mentioned 3 decrees, which are cited in the sources, blah, blah, are still in force, has become a quaestio disputata after the Second Vatican Council, and especially after the promulgation of the Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches, which has been interpreted by some as having effectively abolished the above-mentioned Roman prohibition. But others doubt it. Questioned, the Vatican Congregation for the Oriental Churches has replied that the prohibition is still in force. And that was apparently the case just as of last year. There's all sorts of rumors about that having changed within the last year, within the last 10 months, but until I see it, well, I think I'm going to see it, but until we see it, let's continue reflecting on the problem. Now, Nedungat wrote this in 2002. Those familiar with the present situation know that officially nothing has changed since then, and as recently as 2008, a Vatican dicastery repeated the ban. This would help explain why until recently it was virtually impossible for an Eastern Catholic bishop in the United States to ordain a married man to the priesthood without incurring disapproval from Rome. Also, and this is what's really tragic, in Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, married priests from Eastern Europe and the Middle East are frequently expected to separate from their wives and children. So they become kind of like migrant workers taking care of parishes in France and a place, and their wives are either back in Ukraine, Romania, whatever, or he's in Rome but she's in Milano, you know. With the influx of more than 1 million post-Soviet and Middle Eastern immigrants flooding Western Europe, the number of such clergy ministering to them runs into the hundreds. And incidentally, Canon 758 of the Code of Canons for the Eastern Churches referred to above by Nedungat reads as follows: the particular law of each church sui judice, or special norms established by the Apostolic See, are to be followed in admitting married men to sacred orders. Obviously, for the USA, the Apostolic See has established very restrictive norms. Last year, it had been rumored, and quite frankly, I think that if it weren't for the fact that we now have this Pope, this probably would have gone into effect. Last year, it had been rumored that these restrictions were to become even more restrictive. Fortunately, under Pope Francis, this has changed, but until his influence became pronounced, it seems that the following scenario is where the restrictions were headed. During the last several years, certain Roman dicasteries had been insisting on vetting the case of each Byzantine Ruthenian married candidate individually in Rome. But until last year, it looked like henceforth it would become policy for the vetting to be done additionally by someone in the Papal Nuncio's office, someone in the office of the President of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and 3, the local Latin Rite ordinary of the Eastern Catholic Ordinance territory. Now note that all of the larger Eastern Catholic churches in the USA have their own ordinaries, which from an ecclesiological perspective makes the last part of this proposal particularly odd. In other words, why one ordinary should have to ask another ordinary whether he can ordain his own subject seems a little bit odd. Now, during the discussion we can discuss why there is that concern, but anyway. Okay. And until last year, it was also rumored that the Vatican was suggesting that for any change to occur, the Latin Rite bishops of the USA would have to express their unanimous approval, as was the case in Canada. And people sometimes ask, why is there a difference between Canada and the US? Because in Canada, twice the Canadian Roman Catholic bishops unanimously wrote to Rome saying, we got no problems with married Eastern Catholic priests. Although one of the letters came back saying, why are you meddling in this matter? And of course they then had to write and say, well, we're only signing this document because you wanted to know whether we're unanimous in our toleration of married Eastern Catholic priests. Anyway, considering that even the age of confirmation cannot be agreed upon by all the American Roman Catholic bishops, unanimity on this issue would seem to be quite elusive. Now, in view of the aforementioned, there probably should have been little surprise when in May of 2012, the Cardinal Prefect of the Sacred Congregation for the Eastern Churches told the Eastern Catholic bishops of the USA during their ad limina visit that their priests should embrace celibacy in respect of the ecclesial context. You know that in some circles that set off a firestorm, and there have been some very interesting, very positive developments as a result of that. Now I have 5 minutes left, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to skip to the Vatican II document. I'm just going to summarize the fact that if you read Presbyterorum Ordinis, which actually is a Vatican II document, you get a very favorable estimate of the reality of Eastern Catholic married priests. The conciliar decree actually talks about the fact that these married guys are priests of real merit, of great merit. You know, it's really nice. Then we get into the fact that, fortunately, the Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches of 1990 talks about the fact that the married priesthood is to be held in high regard, is to be held in honor. Now, there is a way to get around actually ordaining married men in North America, because it's supposed to happen according to the particular law, etc. And so there are ways to, make particular law sound very particular. But anyway, the most official documentation is very positive. The problem, like a lot of things in the church, a lot of people just don't bother actually reading the most official documents. I need to read, because I think not all of you are familiar with the fact that then Cardinal Bergoglio wrote some really nice things about Eastern Catholic married priests. This is in a section, I have a different page numbering from you, but in a book, which is a series of interviews with Cardinal Bergoglio and the chief rabbi of Argentina. Cardinal Bergoglio says, I would like to make a clarification. A Catholic priest does not get married in the Western tradition, but he can in the Eastern tradition. There, priests can marry before being ordained, but if they have already been ordained, then they cannot get married. In the Western Rite, to which I belong, priests cannot marry, like the Catholic Byzantine, Ukrainian, or Greek rites. In these churches, the priests can get married, which actually is, you realize the terminology. Even a cardinal sometimes, slips up on the terminology, because he's referring to, of course, the fact that the seminarian could get married, not the priest. The bishops cannot. They have to remain celibate. They are very good priests. I mean, I have to admit, I shed tears when I read that. I mean, somebody saying that we married guys actually are kind of okay. We might do something good from time to time. And then he's got a reflection on other aspects of celibacy. I move on to pointing out that this kind of discussion, or rather this kind of analysis of trends in certain pockets of Roman Catholicism are, I think, important, even though there is real progress, especially in the last 10 months, because the last thing we want to be doing is creating more impediments to East-West reconciliation. I was at a meeting where I said, imagine if someone had been around when the Western Church started increasingly using the filioque. If someone from the East goes, hold it, it's not going to erupt into a crisis for another several centuries, but consider it. Maybe you might want to stop right now, So some of these developments in the theology of priesthood probably should be nipped in the bud right now before they take on all sorts of strange colorations. And I think I am now going to move to the fact that it would be very, very commendable if authors were much more careful in their discussions of celibacy, if they were much more careful in pointing out that what they are proposing is something that is entirely appropriate for the Latin Rite, but not create the impression that this in fact is the Catholic approach. And Cardinal Bea, I have a wonderful quotation, it's a very long one here, it's near the end. Cardinal Bea, during the council, as the council fathers were preparing the Conciliar Decree Presbyterorum Ordinis, he pointed out something that the Roman Catholic theologian Basilio Petra has been stressing a lot, and that is that as we talk about the charism of celibacy, we might also want to talk about the fact that married priests have a kind of charism. And this is what Cardinal Bea wrote back in the early 60s. And I quote, "That which is said in number 14," in other words, he's commenting on a particular part of the draft for Presbyterorum Ordinis, "that which is said in number 14 about the motives, the nobility, the fruits of the celibate priesthood are excellent and should be adopted in full without further discussion. Nevertheless, one notes correctly that celibacy is not required of the priesthood by its very nature. But the things which follow," in that draft, in other words, "are proposed in such an absolute manner that it seems celibacy follows from the very nature of the priesthood. In fact, of the mission of the priest in general, it says that it is completely dedicated to the service of the new humanity," and concludes, "The priests, consequently by means of become a living symbol of that future world." This is Cardinal Bea, remember? He continues, "What then of the married Eastern priests? Aren't they perhaps priests also in the full sense? The schema indeed concedes that in the Eastern churches there are married priests, optime meritos, of the highest of the greatest merit. But they do this as if this could happen as an exception. If I am not mistaken, our ecumenical council," and I say ecumenical, "should treat both priestly conditions, the condition of perfect continence of celibacy and the perfect, as I might have said, ideal marriage of the married priest, whose perfect example for the Eastern Church is of great importance. It ought to be demonstrated how the one and the other should correctly be chosen, educated, and modeled for, or molded for his own condition, and how each one may be able to learn in what way he should be effectively protected against the incumbent dangers of the one and the other condition. Thus our counsel would be greatly useful also to our dearest Eastern brothers." Now, in view of Bea's strong commitment to ecumenism, it should be permissible to assume that his reference to our dearest Eastern brothers may have actually been intended to include the Orthodox and possibly even denote the Orthodox exclusively. And I'm getting now to my last two paragraphs. Finally, my reference above to vigilance concerns also the attitude of certain Catholics to the pronouncements of Vatican II and even the more Latin-oriented encyclical such as Lutatis Celibatus. What's very intriguing, some of the very same theologians who would criticize those authors who try to develop the teachings of Vatican II in any expansive fashion, these same theologians insist that Paul VI did not intend to say the last word on the subject, but rather to indicate authoritatively the direction for future efforts. And what they have in mind is the direction indicated by the findings of new historical and theological research. The new historical and theological research of authors like Cocchini and Trulli and the Cardinal Prefect of the Congregation for the Clergy, who would have us believe that mandatory celibacy, or at least the cessation of marital relations after ordination, is in fact the authentic Eastern tradition as well. North Americans should not be lulled into complacency by the fact that the Latin discipline will presumably never come to dominate historic Eastern Christian lands. It is very hard to imagine that the interwar situation, the situation between World War I and World War II, in which two of the three Greco-Catholic eparchies in Galicia were compelled to adopt mandatory celibacy, could ever revive. Nor should the advances witnessed thus far under Pope Francis create the impression that all is settled. It's my opinion, and I mean, I don't think it's just my opinion, I think it's a well-founded opinion, that popes come and go, and until there are canonical guarantees for a married clergy in all Western countries for Eastern Catholics, until there are such guarantees, and guarantees that are consistently respected, Eastern Christians, in particular Eastern Catholics, should remain concerned. Thank you very much.